Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be with everyone today. My name is Talia Moretti, and I'm a digital sociologist at Ministry of Justice, working on the Modernising Lasting Power of Attorney team. I'm joined today by my colleague, Simon Manby. I'll hand over to you, Simon.
Hi, I'm a senior product manager at Ministry of Justice, working kind of exclusively at the Office of the Public Guardian, really, for the last sort of 8 to 10 years. So we're going to talk about prioritising digital identity policy and tech in your service. We're going to touch on a number of different areas, but I think it's safe to say from kind of a citizen-centric perspective, and a lot of what we've learned from the research that we've been doing really over the last sort of year or so. I'm going to use a card. So, firstly, whenever we come into this, I think it's safe to say that societal awareness of what lasting power of attorney is not exactly brilliant. Although obviously I assume that everybody over the age of 18 on the call has got a lasting power of attorney. We're just going to kind of go through and tell you a little bit about them, if that's all right. So an LPA is a legal document that lets someone, the donor, appoint one or more people to help make decisions on their behalf. It's an incredibly powerful document, and as I say, I don't mean to be flippant. It is something that everybody over the age of 18 really should have, and that quite a lot of people don't necessarily understand how important it is, often until it's too late, and then they find out that some of the powers that they think they have, they ultimately don't. So it's a really important document that allows people to make decisions on someone else's behalf, or importantly, make supportive decision making with people that might not be able to make those decisions on their own without that support. There's 2 aspects of them. We have finance and property and affairs, and health and welfare that are very, very wide ranging, as I say. We started our digital journey, for use of a better word, in 2012, and we had a long way to go. So this was the paper pack. You could either print this yourselves from a PDF download from Justice UK website, it was at that point, or you could request a pack from us and we would send it through the post, and that's what you get if you wanted a property and finance and a health and welfare LPA. Incredibly daunting for people, and there's a lot of what people consider legalese, so things like donor and attorney, jointly and severally, this kind of phraseology makes it quite a complex document that people were looking to create, usually in very stressful times. Can I have the next slide? So we got involved very, very early on with GDS. We were kind of one of the exemplars of the 25, you might remember us from that, and it enabled us to do a lot of stuff. We managed to put an online tool to help people create lasting powers of attorney, but it is very much a tool. It's not a service, because at the end of that process, even if you do fill it out online, people still have to print it out, sign it, send it in to us. We extract 187 points of data out of it, populate a database and send it back to them, because it is an exclusively paper-based process at the moment, and there aren't any other channels, regardless of how people try to interact with that. So within the lasting power of attorney service, we've done as much as we can within the current legislative framework, and we've also looked at other things that we can kind of do around that to help improve the service for users. So we have a use an LPA service now, which enables people to share a subset of their LPA information with a third party to help them to talk about that and to share that information to prove that power is theirs. At the same point, the legal instrument, the paper form, is still the proof of power. And so people are still, if people have any doubts, they still have to present that paper form, and people need to take it around a lot of areas. Can I have next slide, please? So we have worked a lot over the last 8 years to try and kind of really replace a lot of our services and, for use of a better word, digitize our services as best we can. We have a back office service that we developed in-house with along with a company called Transform Engine now they are, which is all open source, open standard. It's built and maintained in-house now, and we iterate it and improve it directly on user feedback from staff and from civil servants that are using it in the same way as we would iterate a customer-facing transactional service. We've got 2 aspects of the business. The first side is for lasting powers of attorney, which are prophylactic measures that people make on the eventuality that they might lose mental capacity. The other side is around deputyships and supervision, and that's when those people haven't had those things in place and need to apply to the Court of Protection so that someone can take on those decisions on their behalf. We've got a number of different customer-facing services, which are all Gov.uk hosted, which all feed into a back office service. And then we take advantage of a lot of the platform services that GDS provide as well. So we use Gov.uk Pay, which is a great service, and Notify, although not across the whole plethora of a bit for various reasons, which I won't bore you with. We use it wherever we can in the service. And it's been a brilliant service for us to use. And we also integrate with the analytical platform, which is a really good piece of work which is going on in central MOJ at the moment to try and sort of bring all of our data into one place so that we can utilize it better for ourselves and for customers. The problem is that all of the stuff on the blue side is exclusively paper-based at the moment. And as I say, we need ultimately legislative change to get away from that. We've tried to change it a few times. We've always come up against problems, particularly around wet signatures. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the decision was made across MOJ policy and digital and with the OPG in the middle of 2019 that we would try and tackle this afresh with a new perspective, try and get a proper multidisciplinary team in place and see what we can do. So what's that look like for us? Modernising lasting power of attorney. This is the work that Lisa and I are doing at the moment. It's a new initiative to try and fundamentally look at this problem space and change it and make it better for the OPG and for customers. So it's been undertaken with sponsors from digital and from policy and from the Office of the Public Guardian. It aims to improve the current system by creating and improve the current system for creating and registering LPAs that is burdensome to the Office of the Public Guardian, Ministry of Justice, and users and third party, predominantly because of this reliance on paper processing. We also want to increase the level of safeguard within the system while retaining access for an equivalent paper service to make sure that we're not losing anybody. Everybody should be able to apply for a lasting power of attorney, and that's a really important tenet of the work that we're doing. At the same point, I think there are lots of things we can improve by looking at how people interact with our services. So we kicked off in May 2019. We passed our discovery assessment, which isn't a GDS thing, but we run discovery assessments in the Ministry of Justice before people can progress to alpha. And I think it's a really good thing. It's about proving those initial assumptions. Is there a problem to be solved? We passed our assessment and we went into June 2020. And we are now in an alpha with what I consider is a really important multidisciplinary team in this area, and we fought really hard to get this in place because without this we can't do the work. I say that we've just lost our delivery manager to MCHLG because she's gone over to Rapid Response, and she's going to do a brilliant job over there. So we are one short on this now. But there's me as a senior product manager. We also have an embedded policy lead, Holly, who is brilliant, which means that policy are embedded within that kind of more traditional digital team functions. And it enables us to be properly cross-functional and to feed off each other's work and to inform each other's work. We also have a lot of research and design in different areas of specialism, user researcher, insight and performance, digital sociologist, which we had to put a business case in for because I think it's an area that people aren't necessarily aware of as a discipline at the moment. Probably only a handful in the world, but it's so important to the work that we're doing, so incredibly important to look at that wider societal impact of the work. Obviously Lisa will talk more about that. We've also got content design, service designer and interaction designer, looking at the wider ecosystem of what we're trying to achieve and making sure that we're providing parity on paper channels and things like this, and that we can rapidly prototype the work that we're doing with users and with stakeholders, and that engagement is incredibly important to us as a team. So we're going to be in alpha for a while, and by that I mean probably 18 months to 2 years, which isn't usual for an alpha, let's say, but that's because we're looking to change legislation as part of the work that we're doing. So we're intending to consult in the spring of 2021. We'll then obviously need government response and then to look at the potential legislative changes and push them through the houses. So it's a big piece of work before we can put live users through any replacement service. So that gives us the luxury of time to explore in this area, which is something that I think there's not many people in government have that luxury to do. So I think it puts us in quite an interesting position for this. Where does that actually intersect with digital identity? Because that's all very well and good, but you're not talking about the thing that we're actually here to listen about. The really important thing for us is that we have a digital tool, as we've said, online, but at the end of that, it has to spit out a deed, and people then have to sign and witness that, and then send that into the organisation, because that is enshrined in primary legislation in the Mental Capacity Act. That while signatures and witnesses don't prevent fraud, they are very important social conventions that people see a huge amount of gravitas around, and are a recognised structure. You know, people think they're very, very important. So if we want to modernise the service, we need to make sure that not only do we put a better set of safeguards in place for what is already in the paper service, but also that we bring in that magic, as Nick, the Public Guardian, says, that recognised social convention and gravitas around that, the act of physically signing a deed and having that contract in place, and then change legislation to support that, whatever that looks like. And one of the safeguards that we're looking at, over and above things like obviously electronic signatures and the various different levels of advanced and qualifieds, but also I think we need to verify identity attributes that are shared with us in a way that is proportionate, but also will help, because this is a very robust legal document and a lot of power that people potentially give up. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at a kind of a medium confidence score of 2 or 2.5, or medium at the moment as our kind of initial hypothesis. And this has given us a good opportunity to kind of talk to what other people are doing in government at the moment. And we've got some things that we think are making it hard at the moment, but also there's a lot of work going on in these areas that will hopefully make it much easier. This is such a quote, and it's one of the problems is definitely data sharing, or what the assumption around data sharing is in government, and particularly across borders. So as I say, we've got a relative luxury of time to explore this, but we are part of a large central department, but we have no pre-existing information with the donor, which means that we have nothing to triangulate that data against when we're looking to verify those credentials in any meaningful way, which means we have to look outside our own kind of sovereign borders to see where we can get that information from. To put a different spin on it as well, it's not like a driving license or a passport. It's not the OPG's power to bestow a lasting power of attorney. It's the donor's power that they're giving up, and we are making sure that that contract is secure and is their intention. So it also brings a huge amount of delegated authority and consent into the work that we're doing. It's a huge important part of it. So we looked around at what was able to be out there. Obviously, we're kind of in the gap where Verify isn't onboarding new services at the moment, so that wasn't an option. We looked at the document checking service, but because we're public sector, we weren't able to get involved in the pilot for that, which was exclusively private sector. And so we looked at what we could do internally and with other government departments and the things that are in place to look at data sharing and collaboration. Anecdotally for me, well, not anecdotally, realistically for me, we've just shared our data with the analytical platform inside MOJ. So that is our data in an Amazon instance to another Amazon instance in the same enterprise within the same department. And that the implementation technically was about 4 weeks. It took us 18 months to get the DPIA and the governance signed off and agreed at the right levels for that. That is exponentially worsened when it's looking at outside of sovereign borders and what you do to share across government departments at the moment. So data sharing is not always treated proportionally. When we're looking at things like just matching attributes, that's still considered in many areas data sharing, and so you have to go through the process in order to try and unlock that, and it can be very complicated, and finding accountability for it can be very difficult. And then what's going on in wider government, I think it's safe to say, unless you're in one of the larger departments who are very far ahead on this or doing their own things in some great spaces, coming into it, responsibility can feel quite confused and siloed as to where responsibility lies for either strategy on this or implementation. And so it was a bit bewildering at first when we came into it. What we need, I think, subjectively, is common standards and governance to allow for greater interoperability and quicker sharing of those things where it is proportionate and right to do so. Better governance around departmental border boundaries and understanding of that, and also within wider public sector, NHS and the blue light services, local authorities are doing some really incredible work in this area, but in very small spaces and with very limited funds at times, and the private sector as well, obviously. Some shared budgets and teams for interdepartmental collaboration to enable that work, because it's very difficult when one side is paying for the other. A scalable identity attribute exchange store within public sector, which is usable. More visible and accountable data ownership and control within departments, so who owns that data and who is ultimately accountable for the use of that data. I will mention data stewards here because I think it's a really important concept, but just fixing the basics on this would be incredibly important. Greater understanding and service teams already using identity in the space. So a register of those, I think Ben Andrews at GDS is looking to build that at the moment, but it would be great to understand what is out there in the landscape, because it's very difficult to find. A more outcome focused and capability based approach to the problem space. There's a lot of tools that do identity, but do they actually fit the models? And they're very different and unique models in government in these areas, and clearer regulation and constraints that we can work with, because I think it would really, really help things, and a greater emphasis on proportionality, privacy, imagined unintended consequences. I don't think there's enough consideration being given to that. I don't think there can be too much consideration given to that, and a way consent and control back to the citizen, which I think is very important to our work, but also to wider government. So that isn't to say there isn't a lot of work going on in these areas, and there really is, and I'd really encourage people to seek these things out. Obviously, the DCMS Trust framework is going to be a great enabler in these areas, but I think it still needs some work, and DCMS are very keen to be involved in use cases and to do research with the people that are trying to do this in the real workplace at the moment across government. So please comment into that work with your own areas. GDS have done some really good stuff on refreshing the good practice guides. GPG 45 is brilliant, and the identity attribute exchange work, so it is ongoing in the background. And then obviously GDS are going into discovery of April with the one login for government and the wider identity work for replacement and eventual replacement for Verify in the future. And then on top of that, we're trying to come together as all of the areas that are working in identity at the moment and try and build a community of practice around this, because we can't do it without one another. And there is so much good work going out there that people can learn from and reuse, but it's very, very difficult to find. So we're trying to use that. And our, from MOJ, our kind of non-partisan aspect in this, where we don't have a lot of skin in the game, but we really want to use the stuff that's out there and bring people together for interoperability, I think has really helped with that. But we want to make that community of practice wider and greater and sustainable in the future. So please get involved if you want to. I think I'm going to shut up and hand over to Lisa and take a breath.
No worries. Thank you so much, Simon. That was really, really great. So one of the other things we wanted to talk to you about is that if you find yourself in the position like us where you need to prioritize digital identity in your service, one of the things you're going to need to think about a lot is around this idea around ethics and compliance. And I'm going to talk about ethics and compliance broadly through these kind of terms: consent, data privacy, and user rights. So from the public's perception of these terms, so the public have moved on a lot in terms of their knowledge and their awareness around data. They understand that their data has value, and they also recognize that it is something to be protected. And so we have actually found that during our own user research that with users that we've tested with, they're very wary about who they give their data to or who they allow access to their data. And we've seen this particularly when it comes to working with private sector or any kind of third parties. So there's a hesitation when it's like, well, I'm giving you this data, but now you're saying that you potentially might give this data to somebody else. Or if we introduce a middleman or a middle party, then there's hesitation to kind of engage further. However, while saying this, so while understanding of data has increased, we still see that knowledge or understanding around what is a digital identity is very poor amongst the public. So in terms of talking about digital identity, we find it quite difficult to engage in some of those conversations and have to really modify our language and our approach when we are talking to people, the general public, about this. We have found, however, that in terms of a sort of a single sign-on solution that somebody can use to access a public service, Government Gateway is referenced a lot as a really helpful tool and something that people really trust. And that comes up in a lot of our different testing sessions. From the perspective of us, those of us who are working in government, we do think that this approach around ethics and compliance can be tackled in a better way within data delivery and design teams. So we talk a lot when we are delivering services about the importance of user needs, but we don't really have a conversation as much about user rights. When you start to work in the space around digital identity, you need to really start having a much more broader conversation about what is this user's rights when they're using the service. So 2 questions to share with you. First of all is, what does somebody need from the service, which will help you kind of tick off that box around user needs, which your user researchers and service designers, etc., will be very au fait with. But a kind of another question then to offer would be, what rights do we need to uphold when we are providing this service? The other piece is around consent. Now, we acknowledge that and understand that there are some problematic areas around consent that we're not going to go into detail today, but we do very firmly believe that consent acts as a very good guardrail for data controllers and data processors. However, from a design and delivery point of view, we believe that consent shouldn't be just seen as something that happens at a single moment in time. User needs and service needs change all the time, and not always do they change in parallel or in tandem with one another. Therefore, should your service needs change and you require different access to that data or need to use that data in different ways, we do believe that you need to get that informed consent again. So when we talk about informed consent, we're kind of highlighting that informed consent is as much as consenting initially to that action, but staying informed about how your consent and access to that data will change potentially over time. We also want to talk a little bit more within the sort of digital identity circles about this idea of trusting the public with their data. So I tend to say quite a lot, like in government, we don't tell people what to do with their money. So, we shouldn't potentially be telling people what to do with their data. And we do think that from a more citizen-centric perspective and with a much more informed and educated public, we need to be moving towards digital identity models where people actually have greater ownership of the data that they have so carefully provided to the government, and that really does belong to them. And then lastly, something that we think needs to be more prevalent in digital and design teams is the use of tech and data ethics frameworks. So we have been very good in terms of creating human-centered products by using user research and embedding those user researchers into our digital and design teams. But some of the things that we believe can really help is the use of ethical frameworks to help and guide decision-making where there is a lack of policy or a lack of best practice or even a lack of case studies that we can share amongst one another. We also wanted to spend the time today just sharing with you some of our overall findings of what we've discovered through our user research. And the very first thing is something that I've just kind of spoken about and sort of raised, and relates to this idea of people becoming much more aware of their value of the data and how it should be protected. But we do see, as I mentioned, that actually people need much greater support around, emerging technology and how that is being used within public services and how that's being used within society. And we need to communicate that from the perspective of value. What value will this new emerging technology provide to this person? And by doing that, we believe that we will be able to raise a much more critical thinking public who can assess new technologies for their value instead of kind of relying on a sort of a default emotional response of, I don't understand this, therefore it's unsafe for me to use. Another finding that we have come across a lot is I am almost prepped and ready for this to come up in user research testing, because it has happened so many times, is why are you asking me this information about myself? You have this information about me already. And this just really leads to a finding that we have found over and over again through testing, that civic blindness is real. Most citizens, most of the public that we have spoken to see government as one massive amorphous blob that is obviously not siloed and obviously is working together. So there is a real blindness to the complex organizational hierarchies and structures that actually exist within government. And there's a lot that we can do in terms of, again, part of that education piece about saying to people why we are asking for this information and this data again. We really have struggled with this, Simon and I, when prioritizing digital identity within our service, because while the technology exists for us to be able to create these amazing new services and to be able to communicate the value of this new technology to the public, there is actually very little to zero, we would say, innovation on public sharing policy within the UK. And I kind of particularly want to spotlight some of the amazing work that's being done by GovLab at New York University around data collaborations. And we really do firmly believe that data collaboration models and frameworks, if done correctly and if implemented within governments, we can actually be able to share data across different sovereign borders in a way that really upholds civil liberties and protects privacy of individuals. But this is a huge piece around the innovation and around digital transformation that we really think needs to be fixed in order for that interoperability to occur. We have kind of discovered this like slightly magic formula within our testing, and we have found that if you are wanting to get data from people, we have found that kind of 4 things need to be in place. People need to be able to have understand a very clear value proposition in a language that they understand. So in the case of us at Ministry of Justice, free from legalese. They want to share data with an organization that they broadly trust, and they want to use a technology that they believe is secure and they are familiar with. Now, this familiarity piece is really important because that familiarity actually builds in the trust, so that those 2 things go hand in hand. But when we find that if there isn't a clear value proposition and somebody doesn't really trust an organization, the entire service or trust in the service just falls through the floor, and you lose that reciprocity with the person that you're trying to engage with. So talking about familiarity and kind of pulling again through that piece around public education and awareness, we've actually found that through our testing, people only need actually quite a little support and a little bit of a nudge and just a little bit of an explanation in a new environment or with a new technology for them to actually start trusting this. And we have really found this to be the case when we were using open banking as a way to verify an identity claim. And we found that when we took people through our open banking prototype and we explained step by step what was happening, they actually got to the end of it and they said to us, oh, that was really easy. Yes, I really trust that. That's really great. But when initially first presented with that proposition, there was a real hesitation. So that sort of gentle nudge and how you design in those gentle nudges is really important. We've also found that not only is awareness around these new kinds of data, new kinds of models and technologies really important for the public, it's really important for your teams. We have really invested in bringing in individuals who are working across governments who are really knowledgeable to do these quick fire talks within our teams and to really raise the awareness and understanding of these new technologies within the team. We've also found that talking about more citizen-owned approaches to data and talking about data ethics has really allowed our team to actually develop new mental models. And we've actually had much more creative and better ethical debates within the team about how to move forward around certain sticky situations that we found ourselves in. So I can really recommend just investing the time. And then another thing I really like to say very often is that digital identity is a team sport. Don't be afraid to reach out to your government colleagues. There are so much amazing work that is happening across government. It's not always easy to find, but please do, if you are looking to connect with different digital identity groups. DCMS, GDS are both doing some really great work. They're really plugged into a lot of different communities and areas of work that are happening, not just within government, but actually across the UK economy. But also there are brilliant people, departments working in this space, such as DWP, HMRC, DVLA, NHS, Scottish Government. They're all working on digital identity solutions and have a wealth of knowledge that they are very happy to share with you. I'm now going to hand back to Simon.
Thank you. So yeah, just a couple of things that we want to kind of talk about if you're starting this from scratch like we were kind of a year, 18 months ago. The first is a lot of stakeholders will assume this is really easy to do and really easy to implement. And so you have to set expectations and you have to set terminology and what you mean by identity. Is identity actually the thing that you need for your service? And I think anybody working in the identity problem space, you kind of end up down a rabbit hole with it. There's no easy solution, but you end up, I'm not entirely convinced I exist as a person anymore. It's an incredibly difficult, complex space, but there's also a huge amount of viable ways to progress and build in these areas. What you don't want to do is just settle on a product. You want to make sure that you're building for capability and that you're finding the right fit and that you're using outcome-based approaches. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that the user needs out of this service? In the same vein, terminology is very, very important. And there is a lot of misapplication of terminology from people with the best of intentions at the moment. And I think there is a need for a shared language and common standards. Luckily, those are out there. It's just they haven't got necessarily widespread adoption, and certainly not outside of kind of the more identity and authentication focused communities. And so make sure that you're getting your definitions right with other people and your stakeholders and your users so that they understand. You can't overestimate how time consuming data governance will be in this. You need to kick off the processes as early as possible and get people embedded and understanding of the work that you're trying to do as early as possible. Whenever we come into this space, I'm always surprised by how little people are aware of the existing stuff that's out there. So please read things like good practice guides. They're very, very good, and they're very good as a way of setting a benchmark between you and stakeholders as well, so you've got common terminology to adhere to, and make sure that anything you're building is adhering to common standards and governments to enable future operability, and think right from the start about your data standards and how you will contribute to that wider government ecosystem in the future in a way that is secure and private but also useful. There's loads of areas and groups that are doing their own thing, but there is a real appetite for collaboration and a commitment to making sure that wherever that work is going on, it's going to be interoperable with itself in the future, and that is the key to everything that we're doing. Hand over to Lisa for the next slide.
So just as a bit of a summary slide for everything that we've kind of already spoken about. So like Simon said, the service manual and the standards are absolutely excellent. However, they do act just as a guide, and thinking much more about user rights, data governance, ethics, and some of that sort of like wider societal impact work is really important for you to do quite early on within your teams. We cannot stress enough how important it is to have someone like a Holly in your team really embed policy from the very beginning. They are going to be sort of the grease to like getting the show on the road, and you cannot build your service without them. It just makes everything so much better. I know that I've harped on this quite a lot, but really please think about user rights as much as you think about user needs, and prioritize user rights. Think about like the right to know more and also the right to decline. While consent does have its limitations, like we mentioned earlier, we do think that it acts as a really important guardrail. If you're quite fluent in the language of consent, something that we would urge you to do is to kind of really push yourself and start to think about community consent. So Jenny Tennyson at the ODI introduced us to this phrase, and it's really helped us kind of think through some of those further societal impact pieces. To Simon's point about some of the terminology and the language, really think about how identity provides value to your service, and then have a conversation with people if you're quite new to it to really figure out, like, is this identity verification? Are you building an entire identity kind of service or identity provision within your service? Is this just an ID match or an attribute, a digital identity attribute match? Is it authentication? Sort of what is it of the identity process are you looking to do? Also thinking about, are you looking to just get this verified at a single moment in time, know who this person is, or are you actually trying to develop sort of an ongoing identity and kind of confirm that over a much longer period of time? Please consider the ratio between high confidence scores and inclusion. The higher you want to go in your confidence scores, very often it starts to exclude more and more people. Not everyone has a passport, not everyone has a debit card, not everyone has a driver's license. So just please be mindful of some of those marginal and vulnerable individuals within society who will be excluded from your service should you set the bar too high. And then lastly, just identity is such a team sport. And because sharing is caring, we just thought we would have this last slide at the very end. So the team is very committed to working in the open, so much so that we have got a site up. It's on a Google site, and you can see the link at the bottom, but this contains all the write-ups of the work that we're doing from our outcomes of stakeholder workshops, and also some of the feedback that we've gotten from our users on our prototype testing. And that is us pretty much. I'm going to check the chats if we have any questions.
So we've got one question in. Our discussion is taking place with the devolved governments to have the same standards. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, yes, absolutely. I know GDS is certainly talking to Scottish and Northern Ireland governments. I think it's a question for GDS rather than us. And so, but certainly from my perspective, from a service team and level perspective, yes, it's absolutely going on. And I think there is a commitment to doing that across the region.
Okay, so I think we're probably going to call it there. We don't have any more questions coming in. If you're looking for Simon and I, please feel free to drop us an email, and lisa.moretti@digital.justice.gov.uk.
Oh, we've got to wait, Lisa.
Oh, okay. I should probably stop sharing my screen and then I can see the... Could we say more on community consent? Oh, this is a really interesting question. Thank you for asking it. And I'm probably not going to do a very really good justice, but I will do my absolute best. So community consent is a different approach to gaining consent from an individual. So this is particularly in the case where an individual potentially doesn't have the ability, so if they've lost capacity to continue to consent to how their data is used, but also from the perspective that if that person requires extra support in making a decision, a community can actually be asked and considered and into how to best make those decisions for that individual. What I can say is that Jenny Tennyson from ODI has a really fantastic blog and has written a lot about community consent. And she is definitely sort of the person who I could recommend you to go read a little bit more about. But her approach is very much about stop thinking about consent as only the way that you can gain that from an individual, but more about how you include a wider community in protecting the rights of an individual.
And then not a question, but someone saying thanks for your really interesting presentation on your difficult and vital work. So that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
really, as we've said a lot, really open to sharing on this. And also, we've not been able to do what we could do without that kind of embrace of the community, particularly considering that we have very little to offer the identity community at the moment in terms of feeding into the wider ecosystem outside of the research and learning that we're doing, which I think is genuinely helping that. But people like Cheryl Stevens and Joe and James and the team at DWP have been so supportive and instrumental in the work that we're doing. Paul Heskins at DVLA, Phil Graham and Stradling at NHS, and Mike and the team over there as well have been, it's a really vibrant community, and there's so much good work going on in it. I'd really encourage people to kind of open up and try and get involved in that. Shall we call it there?
I think so. We don't have any more
Oscar-y.
Okay, super. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. It was really great to be here and to talk to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Have a great rest of the day and rest of sessions.
Bye-bye.